to do his presentation about accessibility for everyone. Şimdi sırada sahneye Filip Maelbrancke'i davet ediyorum. Android for everyone, pardon, accessibility for everyone sunumunu yapmak üzere.
Thank you. Hi, so my name is Filip, and I would like to talk a little bit about accessibility on Android. And I would like to show you that for the people that only know accessibility from Android Studio nagging from time to time, I would like to make a little bit clearer how you can have good accessibility for your Android applications. And that really means that we want to make an application that is going to be usable for as many people as possible. Now, I do work for a company that is called App Foundry. That's an agency in Belgium. We make iOS and Android apps. But I'm going to illustrate a couple of things with some apps that you make at the client of us. Now, unless you speak Dutch, I don't think you will know these brands, but this is a VRT. This is one of the broadcasting companies we have in Belgium. So they have a couple of television stations, radio channels, and then, of course, brands around news and sports, stuff for kids and youth and so on. So among the whole suite of apps we make there, a couple of them are, for instance, an app we use. It's a football app. So that's one of the apps that the sports brand is making. We also have an app that you can use to do like online streaming of your radio. And I'm just going to use these along the talk to make it a little bit more visible what we did accessibility-wise. Now, why accessibility? Well, a couple of years ago, I wasn't really interested in it. We didn't have like a lot of questions about it from our clients. And this is really the first client where I ended up, where it was really important. So the VRT, as I said, is a broadcasting company, and so they really aim to target as many people as possible. And so that also means that people that have like some kind of disability should be served by whatever we make. And so they do it quite well. Quite often, we invite people that are either blind or have like very bad vision, all kind of handicaps, all kind of disabilities, and we really invite them in. And we just give them like tasks. We give them scenarios. We for instance, say, oh, we just made a new news application. Can you try to find the news of yesterday, or can you find what we find the most important news fact in politics today? And so by observing them, we saw that some of our apps are quite bad accessibility-wise, and so that was really a trigger for us to look into it more and really strive to make a good application. And that's really a good thing to do. If you can do that, try to invite some people in from time to time, and you can really learn a lot. And learn a lot, that means that we should step away from a couple of assumptions we way too often make, like the idea that everybody will be able to see what is on the screen, or everybody will be able to touch whatever small buttons you have. Also, not everybody will be able to hear what is coming out of your device, so don't only do like audio-only feedback and so on. And if you take a look at a couple of numbers, it's quite important. Like, if I just start with a minor disability, I would say, but quite frequent, is color blindness. Approximately 1 in 12 men is colorblind. Funnily enough, it's only 1 in 200 women. But that means that if more or less 8% of the people that are going to use your app are colorblind, it's really something that you should think about. Like even for somebody coming from Belgium like me, working for a small market, it's already several 100,000 of people and users that you should think and care about. Also, outside of vision, you can have lots and lots of disabilities and impairments. For instance, motoric impairments, and they can either be permanent, if you are unlucky to have like a sickness like ALS or whatever, or you had a bad accident. But also that can also be that something that is very situational. If you had an accident and you are like out for a couple of months, then you will be quite happy to see that you can still interact with your device and the apps you love. And I would even take that one step further. For me personally, I like to cook, and so I quite like it that I can just talk to my tablet when I'm busy in the kitchen and I have dirty hands. It's quite nice that I can just talk to my tablet, follow a recipe app, and so on. So you don't even have to have a real disability to care about accessibility and how your app can be used in all situations. Now, Android comes with a whole framework called the accessibility services, and there are like 4 big groups in it. I think most of you will know the first one. It's like TalkBack, which is really a screen reader, basically. So if you enable TalkBack, you can do all your user interactions through gestures on the screen, and all the content can be spoken out by a text-to-speech engine. Next to that, if you are blind, you could use a Braille-back implementation, so you can have a Braille reader. And then what we also quite often see is if you have like a problem with fine motoric skills, you will want to use switch access or the newer one, voice access. Now, just to make it a little bit more visible, this is a device that will be used by your blind users. So whatever content is on the screen will be readable by them on their Braille reader, and through all the buttons they can interact with your application. If you, on the other hand, have like a problem with your motoric skills, one of the things that those people need to use is quite often big buttons. So if you don't have fine control over your hands, then this is something we quite often see then. And in this case, when people are only able to use 2 buttons, quite often they will configure it so that one button will be just a next action. So you could already think, I should make it quite clear and quite logical for the user to go like step by step through all the elements in my UI, and then most often they will use the second button as a select action. And then fourth one, voice access, is quite new, but this is the idea that you should be able to do everything through voice. Now, I think most of you already know like Google Now, which is really like the assistant. So we can already for the longest time do these actions like schedule a reminder or send a message or even opening your apps. But voice access is really taking this one step further. It's the idea that everything you do on an Android device, you should be able to do it through voice. So even scrolling, clicking, here you see me opening just a Google Docs document. I can type, I can even edit my text, I can even through voice alone say, oh, I made a typo, correct, and so on. So that's quite powerful, and the idea is really, again, that you should be able to do everything through voice. Now, there's one other remark I want to make, and that's like, for us, a little bit the elephant in the room, iOS versus Android. And to be honest, well, let's take one step back. Especially in Belgium, we see that a lot of people with a disability have an iOS device. And I think you can explain that through history. Like in the earlier years, I think it's fair to say that iOS was a little bit better accessibility-wise than Android. But in the last years, Google have really done lots and lots of work and improving the accessibility services in a tremendous way. But of course, quite a lot of the organizations that, for instance, help the blind or something, they still have like in their mind, oh, iOS is always going to work. We are just going to recommend taking an iOS device. And I think that will take some time until everybody will see that Android can be just as capable a device, accessibility-wise, like iOS. And I would just say, we as developers and designers, we should just make sure that we already take care of it, think about it, implement it. I'm going to show you that it's quite simple to implement and care about accessibility, I hope. And so if only we do our share of the work, then I think in the future, Android and all the apps will be seen just as capable an accessibility-wise device as iOS. So how do we do that? How can we improve the user experience really for everyone? Well, first one, and a simple one maybe, is care about color blindness. So this is my trolling slide. A couple of you should really perceive this otherwise than I do. So really think about the color palette that you use in your app. Technically, it's very simple. Practically, I quite often find it very hard because that means that you will need to interact with your designers who quite often have like either a very strong opinion about what a color should be or quite often we also see that like a client has a certain style, a house style or whatever, and if you then try to convince them that this color is not good enough accessibility-wise, it's not always a simple discussion to have. But in the recent versions of Android, users can already color correct. So if you go to your settings, you can play around with the colors and you can have your Android device help you if you are colorblind. On the other hand, if you are a developer, you can go to your developer settings and you can simulate how somebody with color blindness will perceive your app. So very simple check, you should really do it. Because as we saw, quite a lot of people have that problem. Also think about what contrast you have in the app. So every time you use colors, especially when thinking about text, the general rule is that the contrast ratio between foreground and background should at least be 4.5. And if you Google it, you find lots and lots of tools and websites, standalone tools, plugins for Photoshop, or whatever. It's quite simple to do. I just would urge you to do it. And then, well, still very simple is, text is so important. So Android has the option for the user to play around with text size. You as a developer should at least play along in that system. So always use SP for your text dimensions, and that also means that you should think about your layouts. You should really make them responsive. And so a user can quite easily just blow up the text size, and you should accommodate that. On the right, you see a screenshot of the BBC app, and that's also something we thought about when we are making news apps. When text is very important in the app, when reading is one of the most important actions you can do in the app, we think it's also reasonable to even surface that in the app, to give the user really the option to play around with text size. Now, if we take a quick look through whatever is available on the Android SDK accessibility-wise, first thing is, of course, if you use a screen reader, you want to know what's going on the screen. So first tip I would say is always make sure that you think about what a screen reader will see. So in this case, for instance, I made my nice UI, and all my buttons have like a short prefix for Monday. Of course, that can be quite inconvenient if you have like a blind person going through your UI. So in that case, really make sure that you provide a better content description. That's really the first thing you should do, and the thing that Android Studio nowadays already will warn you about. Same goes for images. If you have an image, always try to provide a content description, unless the image, of course, is purely decorative. And at that point, just make sure that you give it a null content description so that the screen reader will know that it can skip the view, because nothing is so annoying for a blind person if you have like a list of 50 items and they are just scrolling through with a finger, they are listening to what is on the UI, and you have all your just decorative images also triggering the screen reader. Now, you can do that on every element, but quite often that will not be good enough. For instance, in this case, the football application. So just imagine you have a couple of cards in your UI. It's all the matches of teams you're interested in. And if you would just give all these content descriptions on every field, it would say something like in the middle, Arsenal, 3-4, and Liverpool. And that just doesn't make sense. That's not how we talk. That's not natural. So in that case, you would put a content description on the whole container instead of on the separate blocks, so that it nicely will say Arsenal Liverpool finished with a 3-4 score, or something like that. At least always try to think about content description and making it feel feel natural. Same goes for if you have like states in your UI. If you have a button that can change states according to whatever happens, then in code you should think about always providing a good content description. Another thing that you quite often will have is like some part of the UI will magically change. And of course, if you're blind or you don't see very well, that will be a problem for you. So in that case, you can use the accessibility live region. So let's imagine you have a login field and somebody can type in the username, it should be an email, and all of a sudden, you do the validation, and somewhere in the UI it says, this is not a valid email. At that point, you should make sure that that is a live region, so that whenever that changes, it's read out to whoever is using accessibility services. The polite is just one of the ways. There's also something like assert live, and that just means, should I interrupt ongoing speech or not? But that's clearly documented in the API. And also quite often in code, you will know that something happens. If it's not immediately recognizable for the user that has accessibility on, you can also announce it. So you can just announce for accessibility, and at that point, it will just nicely be read out by the screen reader. Same goes, of course, for if you have different states. So in this case, you can imagine in a football application, you could start a team if it's one of your favorites, and you could unstart it again. So always make sure that you put in the right content description. And then the last one I would like to mention is, especially if you have like a motoric impairment, and so if you need to use buttons, for instance, or big gestures to navigate through a UI, then you should think about, well, if the user only has like one button to go next, make it logical and help the user as much as possible. So in that case, the accessibility API also can say, well, the next focus forward should be this UI element, and so on. This is, by the way, also very simple to test. If you just spin up the Android emulator, you will see that you can use the keyboard or also like the directional pad, so the D-pad, you can just use it on the emulator. So you don't need anything fancy to test this. You can just fire up your Android emulator and see, well, if I just click next, 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 or down and down, will I go in a logical way or a logical order through my UI? Now, this is really the basic stuff. This is really what is in the Android API. But we find that quite often we also want to tweak a little bit what is on the screen. So a very simple example is, in the football application, we are unfortunately forced to show advertisements. But of course, that doesn't make sense if you don't see them. Like, we don't get anything of information about the ads. The only thing we could do for a blind person, for instance, is if you go through this screen, it's like a whole big area where nothing is happening, and we could at most say advertisement. That's, of course, nonsense if you can't see it. So in that case, we will just filter out the advertisements. And this is just a simple example, of course, but sometimes we find that we need to tweak a little bit what is going on the screen. Now, how can you know when that should be done? Well, Android has an accessibility manager. So on top, you see we have a system service that you can get a hold of accessibility services. And the first check you should do is, well, is accessibility services, is the accessibility manager enabled? But that is not always enough, and that's one of the reasons is that you can have quite a lot of applications on your phone that use accessibility services in some way. For instance, on my phone, I use Nova Launcher, and they use accessibility services to work around some Samsung bugs, of course. But I also use like an app that's called Twilight, so in the evening, I don't want to have like blue light in my face. That will prevent me from sleeping. And those are all apps that use accessibility services. So you should go one step further, and one of the things you can do is you can also check if touch exploration is enabled. And then the accessibility manager can also give you a little bit more. So we combine the three, and that is also checking whether, in this case, spoken feedback is enabled. And in that case, we are pretty sure that a blind person or somebody with very bad vision impairment is using the app. But you can also ask the accessibility manager for, like, is Braille feedback enabled, or is some spoken feedback or haptic feedback enabled, and so on. So you can reason a little bit about what is going on, and you can tailor your UI and the actions you take for the specific user. Also, I said, well, the first step was make sure that you always have a content description on all the meaningful elements on the UI. You should really think about a good and a meaningful content description. And yeah, don't stress too much about the code. The idea I want to give us here is quite often that means that you have all these cases that you need to handle. Like, for instance, it will be another message if there is no data than whether there is data, but then most languages also make a difference between one item and multiple items. And so quite often you end up with like a whole bunch of string handling just to make these, well, these meaningful content descriptions. So what we most of the time do is, well, we get a little help from our backend. So if you would take a look at the calls we do to our backend, you would, for instance, see something like this. So in all the JSON that is coming from the backend with our data, we have our backend provide the content descriptions. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, we can quite easily share it through over Android, iOS, and the mobile web applications that are all using the same endpoints. So we only do the work once instead of every platform. It's also something that you can very easily change up. You don't need to do a release to change up a content description, and so on. And so this is something that works very well for us. Whatever is needed to think about the content description, we send it to the backend, and we have like meaningful content descriptions coming back with our data. And basically, this, which is just 20 minutes, is already most of what you need to know about accessibility on Android, I would say. If you already do all these tips, and again, I think you will agree with me that this is quite simple, but if you already do these things, you're already quite far along the path of making an accessible application. So I think if you take one message from this talk, it should really be that caring about accessibility is not hard, it's not a lot of extra work, it's something that you can quite easily take along while you are developing your features. Now, one extra example I want to take is sometimes you have you make a custom view or you make a very involved UI, and at that point, just very basic accessibility services will not be the best experience. So in that case, you can go a little further, and I just want to illustrate that with an example. Now, a good example on Android for accessibility is the Google Plus application. That team really cares about accessibility. And so, if I take an example, I went to the GDG Istanbul Google Plus page this week. I took a couple of screenshots, and this is how most of us would use Google Plus. Now, if you have accessibility services enabled, well, you still see the same, but let's first look what's all on the screen. You have all these cards, you have all these little buttons, you can do a +1 to like it, you can comment, you can share. If you click on the text, you will go to the whole article or the whole post and so on. And that's quite hard if you have no fine motoric skills or if you don't see. So if you enable accessibility services, this is what you will see on Google+. So it will, first of all, select a whole card. So it will not really go into all the small views one at a time. No, it's a whole card as one bunch. And then if you know your gestures, you can go to the local context menu. So at that point, you see that by doing that one gesture, which is very easy to do, you get access to the custom actions. And in this case, if you then go to the custom actions, you see that I can do everything I could do if I were like a normally non-disabled user. I also can +1 a post, I also can comment and so on. But this is now the integration with the accessibility framework. These were the local context menu, but really, if you have some kind of disability, you can do almost anything through the accessibility framework, for instance, also global actions and so on. So, how would you make that? It's, again, quite simple. So, I made a small example. It's a little bit contrived. This is not from the real application. But just imagine that, well, apparently, most people like football, so we're going to make a social network around our football. So let's imagine you have news feeds with all your matches from your favorite teams. Could look like this. So you see whatever is happening, and we also have the option to comment, to like whatever happened in a match, to share whatever result. And if you click on a card, you can imagine that you go to the full match detail. So again, this is definitely not a code-heavy talk, but you can imagine that I would have an interface somewhere in my code base that says, well, I want to know when a match has been clicked, when somebody wants to comment, like, or share whatever results we have. So, well, this is how it could look. Again, if I do nothing special, you see the problem here on the right side. So it would just go through every separate view. And of course, like if you're blind and you're just scanning the screen, typically those people go from top to bottom, or they just do next actions. That's also a gesture you can do. But it's quite either if they just scan with their finger, I think they would miss the like button. And otherwise, if they use a next action, just imagine that here are like 50 football matches and you want to go to like place 40 by next actions. That would take forever. So first thing you want to do is, just like Google Plus did, I want to treat this card as one whole. It's quite simple. You can just say, well, no hide descendants in the important for accessibility, and that means that you should now ignore the children of this view group. I'm going to handle whatever I want to do for accessibility. And first thing, you could think, oh, I'm just going to do it myself. I'm just going to show a simple dialogue when I see that accessibility is enabled. Again, a couple of slides ago, we saw how you could see when accessibility is enabled or not. And then, yeah, I'm going to just draw it myself. So when somebody clicks it, I'm going to like show a nice dialogue. But of course, there's a better way. And in the Android SDK, you have the accessibility delegate. So this is part of the accessibility support in the Android SDK. And so you can just delegate whatever you want to do accessibility-wise through a class that you implement. So how does it look? It's a little bit of boilerplate, but the important part is quite simple. So you will just extend accessibility delegates. I think you should use the one that is in the support library, so accessibility delegate compat. And then you will see that I will add my actions. So in our case, you can imagine comment, share, and then like whatever result we have. So you just register basically your actions. And at that point, the accessibility framework will take over from you. So whatever is necessary to integrate with a screen reader, with button support and so on, is now not your concern anymore. You have just registered your actions. Android will take over, and in the end, you will get a call back with whatever happened. So you will say, oh, you will get a call back. Some accessibility action should be performed, and in that case, you can just nicely say, oh, I want to share it, so I'm going to go back to my listener, and through my code say, well, the user wanted to do a share. And after you have written your accessibility delegate, you just register it on a view, and you're ready. So at that point, quite simple again, you have registered whatever custom actions you want to support with the accessibility framework. And at that point, it will look like this. So you see that now my whole card is treated as one. And when we do the action for a local context menu, which is quite simple, it's just up and right if you need that. At that point, you see that all my custom actions are nicely supported, are nicely rendered in whatever way the user has configured the device. And I can do whatever I want, and at the end, I will nicely arrive again in my code paths. So quite simple, and this is already like whatever custom actions you want to provide, whatever intricate view you have that you want to make like better accessible, just use an accessibility delegate, register it with the view, and at that point, Android will do all the hard work for you. And this is basically all I have of code about accessibility. So I think I can still stay at my previous statement that accessibility on Android is in fact quite simple. We should just care about and just start doing it. And so then, if you do it, I just would want to talk a little bit more about how can you then test it? How can you make sure that you have like a good accessible application? Well, first of all, I think you should do still a little bit of manual testing. So like if you're like us, you have a whole bunch of devices laying around, just grab one and start testing. So that means, yes, take a look at, for instance, TalkBack. So this is in the accessibility section of the settings app on Android. And I think I would like to invite all of you to like, in the coming week, take like 10 minutes and just do like the tutorial for TalkBack. It's quite simple, it has a nice tutorial, and I think in 10 minutes time, you can like learn all the basic actions you need to go through your apps like any user with accessibility problems would. And so, it's quite simple to learn all the basic gestures, and then again, if you just spend 10 minutes on it, you will know that things like back is down left, then the local context menu is up right, home is up left, and so on. And just take a little bit of time, and then at that point, you can really just very easily test your accessibility yourself. Now, we're of course developers, so we like to have as much automation as possible, I hope. So Google is now providing a tool called the Accessibility Scanner. It's not that old yet, but it's quite a good idea. So it's an app you can just install from the store, and after you have installed it, you can register it as an accessibility service. And at that point, you have like an accessibility scanner. So how does it look? If you have it enabled, you will have like a small blue dot hovering around above your screen. And this is just the way to trigger the accessibility scanner. What it does is basically, whatever screen you're in, it will basically like take a screenshot and try to analyze and make like an assessment whether that view is good or bad accessibility-wise. So if you would run it on our own app, it would look something like this on the home screen. You just click it, it will take a screenshot, it will reason, it will do a couple of checks, and then hopefully you get something like this. So it has no suggestions, it thinks that our view is already quite good accessibility-wise. I've also taken here Google Play Movies as another example to show what you will see when Accessibility Scanner has like some remarks. So you will get a nice screenshot, it will nicely say which parts of the UI it thinks need improvement accessibility-wise. It also gives like a nice explanation, and it will even like try, if possible, to show you in the documentation what you did forget or what you should adapt accessibility-wise and so on. So quite nice. At the same time, to be honest, this is really like the quick sanity check. So all the basic stuff you should do that can be scanned by the accessibility scanner, it will not, for instance, find everything that is wrong with a custom view. But the good thing is, of course, one, the tool exists and it is there, and Google seems to be, well, very willing to spend a lot of effort in these kind of tools, so this is going to improve quite a lot in the future, I would hope. Another thing you can do as a developer is, we all use lint as a lint checker. And by default, if you would take a look at whatever configuration is by default in Android Studio, you will find that it will only nag you. So like the first slide I did show you, from time to time, lint will be able to flag like missing content descriptions and so on. But if you care about accessibility, I would urge you to just up the severity to an error. So at that point, you can just say, well, I'm also going to run lint so that it aborts the build on an error. Just make sure that these accessibility violations you make in the code have lint flag them as an error, and at that point, every time you compile, you have like a helpful tool saying you at least those quick sanity checks that you should really have in order in your app. And then, quite happy to see that there are quite a lot of testing talks also today on Android. We are also quite big on testing at the company I work at. And so, lint can flag when a content description is missing. But it can't really say a lot about, well, is it really like a meaningful content description? So in that case, you can check it yourself. And for instance, you can do that through your tests. So if you use the Android testing support library and Espresso and so on, you can even make that part of your testing. Well, first of all, you can just do it manually. Like, for instance, you can imagine if we have like a radio application that we can just quite easily write a test that will go through our UI, check all the different states, and while doing that, it can also check if all the content descriptions are whatever they should be. So yeah, that's something we do. It takes a little bit of effort, but we are at least quite sure that we deliver accessibility-wise and that we also don't have regressions. And then I already did show you the accessibility scanner. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have that like in an automated way in our development? And we can. So nowadays in in the espresso contrib package. So that's also, if you do like espresso testing, there's the espresso contrib package. That's also the place where you will find the recycler view actions and the drawer and navigation view actions and so on. So one of the classes you will find in there is the accessibility checks class. So again, quite simple. Just make sure that you use the espresso contrib package. And at that point, while writing your tests, you can also make sure that just set it up for accessibility checks, just enable it, and at that point, you more or less have the same checks that you can see in the accessibility scanner performed during your testing. So that's quite powerful. And so I didn't make a very small example of a bad view. So I did write a simple UI, I did a couple of things wrong, and then I did write an espresso test, and at that point, if I run it, it's quite nice that I already have all those basic quick sanity checks done for me. So in this case, you can quite nicely see, well, I have a unit test saying that one of my content descriptions is missing, and also, for instance, that, well, I have a button someplace, but it's really just too small. It falls below the recommended minimum touch target size. So that's quite nice. All those simple checks can be done and can be just part of your testing suite. Now, that's basically how we think about accessibility. I would say that the documentation on the Android side is quite good, so I hope that I could warm you up to caring about accessibility. I hope that I could show you that it's quite easy and not something to be afraid of. And if you want to take a look into it, definitely check the developer.android.com site. It's quite good, and you will find whatever you need to start implementing accessibility. I've also published like whatever code samples I had for this talk. If you want to take a look, I have them in a small GitHub repo. And so to sum it up, I really hope that I could convey the message that accessibility is not hard. It's part of the Android SDK. It's very simple to work with. If you only do like the simple steps, you have already done like a tremendous work for people that have like a problem. And even if you want to go one step further, even if you want to go like custom views or custom actions and really integrate them with the accessibility delegate, I hope I could show you that it's quite simple and quite normal, I would say, for an Android developer. So if we now know that it's not that hard or not that big of an effort, and knowing that you really make your app usable for so many more people, who, by the way, will quite often be very thankful and very grateful that you went the little extra effort to make the app usable for them. So I really hope that if you start your next project or thinking about the next feature, if you're on the sketching on the whiteboard or whatever, thinking about what you will make, I really hope that you will take accessibility into account and do those small little, really little steps to make sure that your app is accessible for everyone. That's about it. If you have any questions, feel free. Thanks.
Just detailed information. We don't have accessibility scanner in Google Play in Turkey.
Yeah, maybe go to APK.
I tried it because I made the similar presentation. Thank you. I made the familiar presentation at several conferences, and that was one of the best, actually. Thank you for that. Because I'm not a developer, I look from the designer's eye. So we don't have accessibility scanner in Turkey's market, and also there is always a chance being a disabled. And according to World Health Organization, 15% of the Earth population is disabled. So it means more than 1 billion people. So it's a huge amount of target user, maybe.
Absolutely.
So it only, by using accessibility, you're not improving your app for disabled people. Also, you improve it for the regular users, because it pushes you to be more creative and make something more easier. So that was really good. Thank you for the presentation.
Thanks. No more questions? Okay, thanks.